So section 4.5 is all about trying to solve equations that are dealing with an x squared and also an x sometimes. But something we haven't done a whole lot of yet. So there are multiple ways of dealing with this, okay? One of the ways so some of the methods, and these are not in any sort of particular order. But one of the methods is factoring. Sometimes we can just simply use square roots, depending on the equation that we're given. We can use a method called completing the square. And we can use a method that is called the quadratic formula. So if we think of ax squared plus bx plus c as a function, okay, and we were to graph that function, going back to what we talked about as far as graphing quadratic equations go, when we have ax squared plus bx plus c, some sort of quadratic, the graph of that is going to look like either it could be a U, it could be a hill, right? And this U or this hill really could be anywhere on the graph. Okay, I mean, it could be way down here. Or it could be way up here. Okay. So there's all sorts of different options for what the graph of that quadratic might look like. So we are going to think of them as ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So when we rewrite any equation that we're given as being equal to 0, what we are trying to basically figure out is where does that function cross the x-axis. Okay. So each one of these red dots is a solution to the equation ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, depending on what that actual equation is, okay? And it is also called the zero of a function. Where a graph crosses the x-axis is known as the zero of a function. So when we are in a situation where we are trying to solve an equation that has an x squared term and an x term especially, we want to rewrite it to be in the form where basically all the terms are on one side and we just have 0 on the other side, and then we're going to find the zeros of the function. Now, the first method that we are going to look at is going to be the factoring method, since we just talked about factoring. So when we factor something, we take it from being 2 or 3 terms that are being added or subtracted from each other, rewriting it as something that is multiplication, And the reason that that is key is once we have it written as multiplication equal to 0, our things that are multiplied together that equal 0, one or all of them have to equal 0, and so it allows us to solve more simple problems to find our answer or answer. So solve these and check our answers. Now, these are not in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c equal to 0. These are actually already in factored form, right? We have stuff just being multiplied together that equals 0. So we don't have to start by factoring these. These are already in factored form, so we are just going to apply the zero product property. So since everything, we have this times this times this, it's all multiplication. It means that each piece of this we are going to set equal to 0. So the zero product property says that if we have a bunch of stuff multiplied together, whether it's 2 things, 3 things, 7 things, one or all of those things are going to have to equal 0. So we are going to set each of them equal to 0 and then solve. So if x plus 2 equals 0, what would x equal? How would we solve that? Subtract 2 from each side, right? So x equals -2. X minus 3 equals 0. To solve that, we would add 3 to each side, so we'd get x equals 3. X plus 1 equals 0. We would subtract 1 from each side and get x equals -1. Now, by the time we get to the next quiz or test that we take, we should be able to look at this, where these are all multiplied together, and look at this and go, okay, x is going to equal -2 because it's the opposite. X is going to equal 3 because it's the opposite. X is going to equal -1 because it's the opposite. And be done. Okay? Let's look at B. In B, we have x squared minus 1 times x plus 5. This one is a little different because we would have x squared minus 1 equals 0 and x plus 5 equals 0. Now, the x plus 5 being equal to 0 is just like we just looked at. Subtract 5 from each side and we get x equals -5. But the x squared minus 1 equals 0 is different because it still has an x squared in it. How would we solve that? Since it just has an x squared and a number and no x in it, we can still isolate the x term by adding 1 to both sides. So we would get x squared equals 1. How do we undo a squared? What's the opposite of squaring something? Taking the square root. And when we take the square root, we have to consider that it could be a positive or -1. The other thing that we could do way back here at x squared minus 1 equals 0 is factor this further. Because this is the difference of two perfect squares. So it would factor into x plus 1 and x minus 1, and then we could go from there. So now the other part of this said to check our answers. So what we should do is look at part A and look at x equals -2. If we put in -2 for x, we would get -2 plus 2 times -2 minus 3 times -2 plus 1. And I want to know, does that equal 0? So -2 plus 2 would give me 0. -2 minus 3 would give me -5. Negative 2 plus 1 would give me negative 1. 0 times negative 5 times negative 1 is definitely going to be 0. So I would keep that as a solution. Now I would do the same thing for 3. And whether you actually write these down or do them just mental math, is either way is fine. So you would get 5 times 0 times 4, which definitely equals 0. And if you put in negative 1, you'd get 1 times negative 4 times 0, which definitely equals 0. So all 3 of those answers would be correct. So this example, we're going to start from the beginning. We're just given a quadratic equation that is not in factored form. So we're going to actually factor it and then solve. Okay. So if we look at part A, we are looking for 2 numbers that multiply to what? So we find our 2 numbers that multiply to 6 and add to negative 5, and then what? Once it is in factored form, we are going to go into solving mode. Now the shortcut, what number would make x minus 2 equal 0? What number would you put for x to make, you put in 2, right? To make that 0. And what number would we put in for x in x minus 3 to get 0? So the shortcut is just take the opposite. We had minus 2 here, so it becomes x equals 2. We had a minus 3, so it becomes x equals 3. In this problem, we're done. That's it. Let's look at part B real quick. Now, the thing about the problem in part B is we have x squared minus 7x equals negative 12. I want it equal to 0. I don't want anything on the one side of equation but 0. So we're going to need to first get that 12 to the other side. Okay. So get everything on one side of the equation first. So I'd have x squared minus 7x plus 12 equals 0. Once you have it equal to 0, then you're going to try to factor it. So parentheses, x's, then what?